if you were in the pastor's position, someone may be watching this video right now, and if you were in charge of some kind of a church expansion project, whether it's the big new construction or renovation, whatever it might be, what are those 2 or 3 things that you do first?
Well, first, going back to the source and use. First, determine what your affordability is.
Sure.
And then get a good handle on the use. And thirdly, make sure that the two are talking to one another.
Right.
Obviously, at very, very early stages in a project, it's hard to know what that's going to cost. So normally I would coach a church to sort of really run those two things, determining source and determining use, concurrently to some extent. Certainly, never spending any money or going any further down the track of building a building until you really know what that source is.
Sure.
But getting source and use nailed down initially is definitely
that's a priority.
Paramount.
So you had talked about what from a process standpoint. I know that one thing we've talked about is when do you get a lender involved, speaking to the ways to fund it, but also when do you get an architect involved?
Yeah.
So when a pastor is dreaming, and maybe they're even talking to their church board about it, saying, hey, this is coming in the future. I feel that we should do this. When do they bring in an architect? When should they start that conversation with a lender?
Sure. Really depends on the project. This is so project specific.
Okay.
Generally speaking, I would say you want to bring the right lender in very, very early. A good lender will not just ask you, how much is your project going to cost. They're first going to help you determine, again, your source of funding. What can you really afford? And not only what can you afford, but what can you afford to a healthy level within your church so that your ministries can still flourish. Again, you can do all of the things God's called you to do without overburdening yourself with debt.
Sure.
So a good lender will be able to give you your affordability within those healthy limits at the onset so that you can then go out and begin making your plans toward that project.
Right.
Again, with the goal in mind that the ultimate, at least the initial phase, fits within your ability to afford whatever that is. Again, considering your 3 sources of funding. So that brings up the idea. I said phase, meaning when you begin dreaming about what you feel like God's calling you to do and how your facilities should look. We know that often that is an extremely large. We mentioned master planning, so so that can be a very, very expensive, very large scale project that you may not do that all at once. So oftentimes we'll see a church actually build in phases, and so obviously the goal there is that phase 1, whatever you're going to do initially as part of that phase, fits within your ability to afford it.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we talked about when to bring in a lender. Architect, you talk about a master plan, which I know an architect will usually help with.
Correct.
When should that phone call be made, or when should a church look at options for an architect?
So once again, church specific, but I would say when they get to the point where they have the DNA nailed down, they know what that is, you're very, very clear on vision, you're very clear on mission, you have some idea of what you think you need to do. At that point, and again, I think when you have an idea of what your affordability is, bring an architect in. And so I think the timing is not as important as the way you do it. And here's what I mean by that. Most architects, they work within about 4 different phases of their process. And oftentimes an architect, when they first start talking to a church, they'll want to sort of, for lack of a better term, sell the church on all 4 phases at once. Hey, I want to be your guy from phase 1 to phase 4. Phases 1 through 4 typically, and I realize this could vary a bit, but typically would be they're going to look at site work, feasibility as kind of that first phase. Then they're going to go into schematic design. What's the building potentially going to look like? From there, they will go to design development. So once we agree on that schematic design, we're going to go to the next step of developing that design a little more. And then the 4th phase would be actual construction documents or blueprints.
Okay. Right.
So my advice again would be not as much focusing on when do we bring them in as when we do bring them in, let's take this one phase at a time. so that you're only contracting with the architect for phase one, not all the way through phase four, so that you can then take a stop, sort of hit the pause button after that phase one, being the site and feasibility, to go, okay, based on this, let's measure that against our affordability. Is what we've thought about and put on paper with the architect's help so far, does that use still fit within our source?
That makes sense. So Shawn, you've talked about, if you were a pastor, what you would do first. You talked about things that they should consider, when to bring in an architect, when to bring in a lender. And I know what I'm about to ask has a list, this long, but if you could talk about even just one common issue or hurdle that churches have seen when doing a construction project, what would that be? What comes to mind?
Over-designing for their budget. The use is out of whack from the source, basically.
So basically, they're dreaming here, and they and an architect are designing here, but like they can afford here.
Correct.
Okay, that can be a significant
That's a
issue.
big one.
And that goes back to what you were saying, even in the very beginning, sources of funds, what can you
Yes.
afford, all that. So that's great, Shawn. So Shawn is nice enough to have created a church construction white paper, which is available on the AG Financial website. What we talked about today is like this much from all the insights that Shawn has made available through the white paper. So I highly recommend you download it, again, on agfinancial.org. But Shawn, thanks so much for sitting down with us today, just cluing pastors in on what to consider when they
Absolutely.
take on a church construction process, which is a lot of fun, very exciting. So
You bet. Thanks,
Shawn, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.